I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now. I'm serious. Put down whatever's in your hand, take a breath. Because I was there. I was standing maybe 40 feet away from the whole thing, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. Not the version that got cleaned up for the Galactic Cultural Exchange newsletter, not the diplomatic summary that went out to the council, not the 3-paragraph press release that called it a minor misunderstanding of cross-species behavioral expectations. The real version, the one that has been sitting in my chest like a stone for 6 months. Because what I watched happen in that arena was not a minor misunderstanding. It was one of the most quietly terrifying things I've ever seen in my life, and I've been working in xenocultural integration for 11 years. I've seen Volkai war priests lose their composure during mediation sessions. I've watched a Drenathi diplomat accidentally trigger a room-wide sonic aggression response at a peace summit. I've been in rooms that nearly ended badly in ways that don't get written into reports. But I have never, not once in my career, seen a human being look at a room full of apex interstellar hunters, hear a princess of the Solving Empire say, "You will fall in seconds," and do absolutely nothing. No fear. No bravado. No performance. Just nothing, like the words hadn't landed. Like she'd said something as interesting as, "It might rain later." And that nothing is what broke her. Section 2, Setup. Let me give you the picture. The Solving Cultural Delegation had been on Earth for 9 days before the incident. 9 days of carefully managed diplomatic hospitality, climate-controlled accommodations in the Geneva Interchange Complex, culturally calibrated food service, translation arrays that had been running field tests for 3 years before the visit was even confirmed. The entire operation had taken the Galactic Cultural Exchange Authority 4 years to organize. 4 years of preliminary negotiations, protocol drafts, behavioral cross-referencing, and enough pre-visit anxiety to give the entire integration division collective insomnia. The Solving don't visit places. That's the thing you have to understand first. They don't come to planets the way diplomats come to planets, with briefcases and talking points and a carefully prepared smile. The Solving send assessment teams. They come to a civilization the way a predator comes to a new piece of territory, slowly, quietly, measuring everything before they commit to a single movement. They're not hostile. That's actually the important part. They're not violent, not invasive, not aggressive in the way the early contact reports made them sound. But they are, and this is the only word I've found that fits, evaluative. Everything they do is evaluation. The way they move through a room, the questions they ask, the silences they hold. They're always measuring, always calibrating, always deciding where everything and everyone falls on whatever internal hierarchy their civilization has been building for the last 3,000 years. And at the top of that hierarchy, at the very peak of it, are the Solving warriors. Specifically, the Solving Imperial Guard. I'd read the files before the delegation arrived. The Integration Division had compiled 1,200 pages of cultural and biological data on the Solving, and I'd gone through most of it in the weeks before they landed. But reading about the Imperial Guard and seeing them in person are 2 different experiences in the same way that reading about a mountain and standing at its base are 2 different experiences. There were 6 of them. 6 guards who had been assigned to travel with Princess Velara, the youngest daughter of Emperor Solving IX, and the first member of the imperial family to participate in a direct cultural exchange visit to a Category 3 world in recorded history. Category 3, for context, means a civilization that has achieved interstellar capability but has not yet been formally integrated into the galactic community. In other words, us, humanity, still new, still being watched. The guards were tall, between 8 and 9 feet, all of them, though the way Solving bodies are proportioned makes them look simultaneously larger and more graceful than that measurement implies. Their exoskeletons, the layered, semi-translucent armor plating that Solvin warriors grow naturally as a biological adaptation, caught the light in the arena in a way that made them look like they'd been assembled from fragments of stained glass. Deep blue-green at the edges, shifting toward a darker, almost black color at the center plates. Their eyes, all 6 of them had the same amber gold eyes that the Solvin are known for, never stopped moving, never stopped scanning. They didn't speak much. The guards weren't there to make conversation. They were there to assess threats, manage proximity, and ensure that nothing and no one got close to Princess Velara without being fully evaluated first. The princess herself was something else entirely. She was younger than I'd expected. The files had told me she was 32 in standard Solvin years, which translates to roughly 26 by Earth's reckoning, but something about the way she moved made her seem both younger and much older than that simultaneously. She was smaller than her guards, most Solvin royals are. It's a biological distinction that has to do with the energy cost of exoskeleton growth in high-nutrition environments, but she had a presence that filled whatever room she walked into. Not aggressive, not theatrical. Just present, completely, utterly, unignorably present. And she was curious. That was the thing that stood out most in those first 9 days, the curiosity. She asked questions constantly, real questions, not the polite diplomatic phrasing that officials use when they want to seem engaged without actually committing to interest. She asked about construction methods. She asked about human sleep cycles. She asked about the decision-making process behind a food menu. She asked our cultural liaison, Dr. Priya Mehta, 17 questions about the design of human shoes in a single afternoon, because the concept of foot enclosure as a cultural choice rather than a biological necessity genuinely fascinated her. She was sharp. She was genuinely engaged. And this is the part that matters for what came later. She was used to being the most dangerous thing in any room she entered. That's not arrogance. That's just solving reality. In their world, and in most of the galaxy, frankly, it's true. Princess Velara, in addition to being a member of the imperial family, was a trained combat specialist. Solvin royals undergo a mandatory decade of warrior conditioning before they're permitted to take on any diplomatic or administrative roles. Not ceremonial training, real training. The kind that produces results that would make any military strategist on Earth genuinely nervous if they saw the performance metrics. She had, according to her personnel file, which the Solvin had voluntarily shared as part of the Cultural Transparency Agreement, a combat assessment rating that placed her in the 93rd percentile of all active Solvin military personnel. She'd competed in the Imperial Challenge Circuit 3 times and placed in the top 4 each time. She had reflexes that the medical data described as operating at roughly 3 times human baseline speed, and a grip strength that the comparative physiology notes described, somewhat dryly, as significantly beyond human structural limits. She was, in other words, extremely good at winning physical confrontations. And she was about to meet Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb. Section 3, Build Up. The Cultural Combat Exhibition was not supposed to be a combat exhibition. That's the first thing I want to make clear. The event had been planned as a demonstration of human athletic and martial heritage, a showcase of how physical discipline, in various forms, had shaped human culture across different civilizations and time periods. The Integration Division had designed it specifically as a low-stakes cultural experience. We were going to show them some judo, some traditional wrestling forms, some historical European swordsmanship, some capoeira. The kind of thing that demonstrates, yes, humans have warrior traditions too, without suggesting anything that might read as threat posturing to a delegation from an advanced military civilization. The venue was the Geneva Interchange Complex's indoor arena, a wide, open space with a polished floor and gentle lighting that the Solvin Environmental Preference Team had pre-approved. It seated about 200, and there were roughly 160 people present. A mix of integration division staff, human cultural representatives, and a handful of Galactic exchange journalists covering the historic visit. The solving delegation, the princess, her 6 guards, 3 scientific advisors, and 2 diplomatic aides, were seated in the observation section at the eastern end of the arena. The seating had been adjusted to solving proportions: wider chairs, slightly elevated platforms, no overhead obstructions. Small details. But that's what integration work is: 1,000 small details that add up to. We see you as you are, and we want you to be comfortable. The demonstration started well. Really well, actually. The judo display got an unexpectedly strong response. One of the solving scientific advisors started taking detailed notes almost immediately, which our team took as a very good sign. The capoeira performance left the entire delegation visibly absorbed. Princess Velara leaned forward in her chair during the historical European longsword demonstration and asked Dr. Maida 3 questions in rapid succession about metallurgy and historical context. Then came the mixed martial arts segment. It hadn't been part of the original program. I want to be clear about that too. It was added 2 days before the event by the Integration Division's Cultural Outreach Coordinator, a well-meaning but slightly over-enthusiastic man named Gerald, who had decided that since the solving were a warrior culture, they might find contemporary human combat sports more relatable than purely historical demonstrations. Gerald had presented this as an opportunity for cultural resonance. Several people on the team had expressed reservations. Gerald had prevailed. This is the part where I'd say that Gerald's instincts weren't entirely wrong. The solving were, in fact, very interested in the demonstration, just not in the way anyone had planned. The fighters who'd been arranged for the segment were good. 2 of them were professional MMA competitors with solid records, brought in through a sports liaison program. The plan was a controlled sparring round, nothing too aggressive, nothing that might read as genuine violence to the delegation. Friendly, demonstrative. But when the fighters stepped onto the mat and the round began, something shifted in the atmosphere of the arena. I felt it before I understood it. A kind of a tension that hadn't been present during the earlier demonstrations. A sharpening. I glanced toward the solving section and saw that all 6 guards had straightened. They were very still, that particular kind of stillness that I'd learned over the past 9 days indicated maximum alert processing. They weren't tense. They didn't look alarmed. But they were watching with a quality of attention that was different from the relaxed cultural curiosity they'd brought to the judo and the capoeira. They were watching the way hunters watch. And then I noticed the princess. She was watching too, same quality of attention, same stillness. But there was something else in her expression, something that looked, and I want to be careful about how I describe this because cross-species facial interpretation is genuinely difficult, but something that looked like amusement. Not cruelty, not condescension, just amusement. The kind of expression you might have watching a child attempt something that you could do in your sleep. The exhibition round ended. Applause, normal program. And then, and this is where things went sideways, Gerald walked onto the floor. Gerald with his tablet, his enthusiastic smile, and his absolute conviction that he was about to create a meaningful cultural moment. I saw Dr. Maida's expression change the instant Gerald picked up the microphone. She knew. I think several of us knew, in the way you know when something is about to go slightly wrong in a way that can't be stopped because the machinery is already moving. Gerald announced, with the best of intentions, I want to be clear about this, that the Integration Division was extending an open invitation. Any member of the solving delegation who wished to participate in a friendly demonstration of combat technique was welcome to join a human partner on the mat. The translation array carried it in perfect solving high standard. There was a pause. Not a long pause, maybe 3 seconds, but 3 seconds is a long time when 200 people are holding their breath. And then Princess Velara stood up. The murmur that went through the human section of the audience was, I don't know how to describe it. Not panic. Not exactly. More like the collective intake of breath that happens when you're watching someone do something that you can't stop and you're not entirely sure how it's going to end. The princess spoke. The translation array rendered it, I accept, I will demonstrate. Her 6 guards did not stand. That was notable. They exchanged a look, some kind of non-verbal communication that the Integration Division's behavioral specialists later spent 2 weeks attempting to interpret, and then they settled, composed, watching. They weren't worried. That's what I kept coming back to later. They weren't worried at all. Gerald, to his credit, held it together. He thanked the princess warmly, explained the MAT guidelines, and then turned to consult with the 2 MMA fighters about which of them would be the most appropriate partner for. Not them, the princess said. Gerald turned back. She was looking at someone else. I followed her gaze. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb was standing near the equipment staging area at the north end of the arena. He wasn't part of the demonstration team. He was part of the security detail, specifically, the small contingent of human security personnel that the Integration Division maintained at the complex, mostly as a diplomatic formality. Having uniformed human military-adjacent personnel present during the solving visit had been a deliberate symbolic choice. We have warriors, too. We're treating your visit with appropriate seriousness. Webb had been standing near the wall for the past 2 hours doing exactly what security personnel do, being present, being professional, and watching everything without looking like he was watching everything. He was maybe 6 feet even, which is not a small person, but is absolutely not impressive in a room where the smallest solving guard has 4 inches and 150 pounds on him. He was in Integration Division security dress, dark uniform, no visible weapons, nothing that would read as aggressive to the delegation. Short hair. A face that was, I remember this specifically, completely unreadable. Not blank, not closed, just neutral, the kind of neutral that isn't performed. He was probably 35, maybe 36. There were lines at the corners of his eyes. There was a small scar along his left jawline that his uniform collar didn't quite hide. His hands were at rest at his sides in the way that hands rest when the person they belong to has spent a long time learning how to keep them that way. Princess Velara was looking at him the way she'd been looking at the capoeira performers, with that focused, calibrating attention. She said something in solving that the translation array took a moment to render, because it was a phrase from a specific cultural register that the array's contextual processing needed a second to categorize correctly. What it came out as was, that one, the quiet one. Section 4, the encounter begins. Gerald made a noise that was not quite a word. Dr. Maida stepped in. She was very good at stepping in. It was essentially her primary professional skill at this point. She spoke quietly with Gerald for approximately 4 seconds, then turned to the princess with her most professional smile and explained that Sergeant Webb was part of the security detail and not part of the demonstration roster, and that the Integration Division would be happy to provide any of the. I would like to speak with him, the princess said. Not a command, just a preference stated with the quiet certainty of someone who is used to preferences becoming reality. Dr. Maida turned to look at Webb. Webb had been listening. Of course he had. He'd probably been tracking every word in the arena from the moment the delegation sat down. He gave Dr. Maida a look. She gave him a look back. Some kind of rapid, silent negotiation that lasted about 2 seconds. Then Webb crossed the arena floor. He walked the way he stood without performance. No adjustment in posture when he became the focal point of 200 people and a full solving imperial delegation. No squaring of shoulders, no lengthening of stride, just a steady, even walk that covered the distance in about 15 seconds. He stopped at a respectful distance from the princess, not close enough to be presumptuous, not far enough to be dismissive. He inclined his head in a way that managed to be respectful without being deferential, a distinction that I later realized was probably more deliberate than it looked. "Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb," he said. His voice was even, not loud, not soft, just appropriately audible. "Integration Division Security Detail." The princess studied him. The guard studied him. The entire arena watched the Solvin Imperial delegation study a single human security guard, and the arena was very, very quiet. "You have the stance of a trained combatant," the princess said. The translation array was rendering her Solvin high standard with precise clarity, and the phrasing was interesting. Not a question, an observation offered as an opener. "But you have not moved to demonstrate this evening." "I'm not on the demonstration roster," Webb said. "Why?" Webb paused for exactly one beat. "Because my job tonight is to watch, not perform." The princess made a small sound. The behavioral specialists later categorized it as an expression of mild appreciation, the Solvin equivalent of acknowledging a well-made point. But in the moment, with the ambient tension in the arena and the attention of 6 Solvin warriors all pointing at this one man, it sounded more significant than that. "I would like to understand human combat capability," she said. "Not the performance you have prepared. I have been watching those demonstrations. They are practiced, arranged for observation. I would like to see something unscripted." "The Integration Division has arranged some excellent." "I would like to see yours," the princess said. Another beat. "I'm not sure that falls within my operational." "I am asking," the princess said. And then, and this is the moment that I keep returning to when I try to understand what happened next, she smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, not a performance smile, a real one with something behind it that was almost playful. "I have reviewed your species' medical documentation. I have read your biological specifications. I understand that the biological gap between your kind and mine is significant. I am not proposing a true contest. I am proposing an educational demonstration for cultural understanding." She paused. "Unless you have concerns about participating." And there it was, the edge of the challenge, wrapped in perfect diplomatic phrasing, embedded in what was officially an educational request, but there, unmistakable for anyone paying attention. I saw Dr. Maida's expression. I saw Gerald's expression. I saw the expressions of about 150 human beings who had all simultaneously registered the same thing. The princess had just issued a challenge so politely framed that refusing it would look like avoidance, and accepting it would put a human security guard on a mat with a Solvin Imperial warrior, whose combat assessment rating we all knew was in the 93rd percentile of active military personnel. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me get clearance from Dr. Maida." He stepped back. He walked the 12 feet to where Dr. Maida was standing. He leaned slightly toward her and said something that I couldn't hear from my position, but that I later learned, because Dr. Maida told me verbatim, was, "What do you want me to do here?" And Dr. Maida, who is one of the most tactically intelligent people I have ever worked with in 11 years of integration work, said, "I think you need to participate, but I need to know, are you going to be okay?" Webb looked at her steadily. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "I've been in worse positions than this." And he walked back to the mat. Section 5 on the mat. What happened in the next 90 seconds changed the tenor of the entire visit. I want to be precise about the time because I know how retelling can compress or expand moments that felt significant. The Integration Division's recording systems logged everything. The arena had 6 camera arrays running from the moment the delegation entered. 90 seconds. Not 90 minutes, 90 seconds. But those 90 seconds are what every single person in that arena will remember for the rest of their lives. Webb and the princess took their positions on the mat. The protocol the demonstration team had established was simple. No strikes intended to cause injury, no joint manipulation taken to its breaking point, engagement until one party yielded or was clearly unable to continue. Dr. Mehta explained this to the princess through the translation array. The princess listened. She nodded once. Then she looked at Webb. And she said, loudly enough for the translation array to catch and render for the room, "You will fall in seconds." Not cruelly, not tauntingly, almost matter-of-factly, the way you might tell someone this door opens inward because you happen to know something they might not, and it seems useful information to share. The first guard, I learned later his designation was Commander Ashtel, shifted slightly in his chair. The behavioral analysis team would later note that this was a solving nonverbal expression of mild anticipatory satisfaction, not malicious, just the comfortable certainty of someone watching an outcome that they already know. Webb said nothing. He didn't adjust his stance. He didn't change his expression. He didn't blink more often or breathe differently or do any of the things that happen to a human body when it registers a threat and processes the possibility of being humiliated in front of 200 people and an alien imperial delegation. He just waited. The princess moved first. She moved the way the file descriptions had suggested she would, fast. Not fast in the exaggerated way of action media, but fast in the specific, purposeful way of someone who has trained a movement until it is no longer thought about, just done. A lateral approach, low, designed to displace Webb's center of gravity. Webb wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere dramatic. He hadn't leaped or rolled or performed some cinematic evasion. He'd simply moved. Shifted weight, adjusted stance, redirected, and the princess's approach found empty space where he'd been a fraction of a second before. The arena made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite silence, something in between. The princess recovered instantly. She had the physical capability for instant recovery, and she used it. Second approach, different angle, calculated to account for the direction Webb had moved in the first exchange. Webb moved again. Not the same way, not a pattern, just available space identified and occupied before the approach could close the distance. The princess stopped. She stood in the middle of the mat and looked at him. This was the moment. This is the moment I keep coming back to. Because what happened in the princess's expression during those 2 or 3 seconds of stillness was something I had never seen on a solving face in 9 days of careful observation, and I had been watching very carefully. She wasn't angry, she wasn't frustrated, she was recalculating. The confident amusement was still there, but something had shifted behind it. A small adjustment, like someone who has looked at a problem and found that it contains a variable they hadn't fully weighted. She came at him a third time. Different approach entirely, not a displacement attempt but a direct engagement, designed to use her strength advantage to simply close the equation. What Webb did in the next 4 seconds is the part that I watched the recording of 17 times in the week after the incident, before I felt like I could describe it accurately. He didn't meet her strength. He didn't try to. He didn't do anything that involved pretending the strength differential didn't exist. Instead, and I'm going to use the closest accurate language I can, he stopped being where her force wanted to go. Every time her momentum had a destination, he made sure he was somewhere adjacent to it. Her strength went into the mat, into the air, into trajectories that never completed, because the target they were aimed at kept being somewhere else by the smallest possible margin. It was the most efficient thing I've ever watched a human being do. And it wasn't flashy. That's what hit me hardest, watching it. There was nothing about it that looked like a performance. No expression on his face, no dramatic movement, just this completely quiet, completely precise series of tiny adjustments that turned every one of the princess's approaches into a vector with no destination. At the end of those 4 seconds, the princess was facing away from Webb, her momentum having carried her 3 steps toward the edge of the mat, and Webb was standing exactly where he'd started, still, breathing normally. The arena was absolutely silent. The princess turned around. She looked at him, and the expression on her face, the expression that 200 humans and 6 Solving warriors all saw in that moment, was one that none of the behavioral analysts needed cross-species training to read. She was surprised, not frightened, not threatened, not even fully understanding yet, I think, what she was looking at, but surprised in the deep, genuine way that happens when someone who has spent their entire life being the most capable entity in any given room encounters something that doesn't fit that framework. She said very quietly, so quietly that the translation array almost didn't catch it, "You moved around my force." Webb looked at her steadily. "I noticed your force was larger than mine." "A beat. So you chose evasion." "I chose efficiency," Webb said. "Another beat longer." "Demonstrate again," the princess said. Section 6, the second exchange. What followed was less a demonstration and more, I don't know how to describe it. A conversation, maybe, except conducted entirely in movement and position, and the language of 2 beings who are both very good at understanding how bodies work in space. The princess came at him differently now, not with the initial confident speed but with something more considered. She was watching him the way the guards had been watching the arena all evening, with that measuring attention, processing, adjusting. And Webb was watching her back. They moved together for about 40 seconds. It didn't look like a fight. It barely looked like sparring. It looked more like 2 people working out a problem from opposite sides. The princess testing approaches, Webb responding, each exchange lasting only a second or 2 before it resolved into stillness and reset. The princess was adapting fast. She was genuinely talented, genuinely skilled, genuinely quick in both the physical and cognitive sense. Her adjustments between approaches were getting sharper, her vectors getting more varied, her timing shifting in ways that were clearly intended to break whatever pattern she thought she was detecting. And Webb kept not being where the patterns expected him. At some point during those 40 seconds, I couldn't mark exactly when Commander Ashtel stood up. Not with aggression, not as a protective response. He stood the way someone stands when they've seen something unexpected in a landscape they thought they knew well, and they want a better angle to look at it from. His 5 colleagues didn't stand. They just watched more intensely, if that was possible. The moment that everything crystallized happened about 38 seconds into the second exchange. The princess had shifted her approach strategy completely. She'd stopped trying to use displacement or direct force and had gone for a containment approach instead. 2 hands, precise positioning, designed to use the strength differential to simply hold rather than throw or topple. In theory, it was a sound adjustment. Against a target that couldn't match her strength, containment would simply end the equation. Hold until yield. Her hands closed on Webb's wrist. And Webb, without any visible urgency, without any dramatic response, rotated. Not a powerful rotation. Not a rotation that required muscle or leverage or any force that Webb could generate beyond what a normal, fit human being can generate. A rotation that used the natural axis of a joint in the specific direction that solving grip anatomy doesn't naturally follow, combined with a weight shift that moved his center of gravity in the exact direction that made the grip want to release rather than hold. He was out of her hold in about a quarter of a second. And then he stepped slightly to her right, and there was a moment, one single moment, where his positioning relative to hers was such that if he had chosen to do anything other than be still, She would have had to spend a full second reorienting before she could have effectively responded. He didn't do anything, he was still. But she knew. That was the thing. She knew what that positioning meant. She had the tactical vocabulary to read it, and she read it, and her eyes, those amber gold eyes, went from calculating to something else. She stepped back. She stood very straight. And she looked at him the way, and I've tried to find a better analogy, and I keep coming back to this one. The way you look at something that you've been wrong about in a way that you're now realizing requires you to revise several other things as well. She said, "You were never going to fall." Webb said, "I told you, I just moved around the force." "You have been trained," she said, "not a question." "I have been trained," he confirmed. "In what?" A pause. "Staying alive when the other thing is bigger than me," he said. The arena was still completely silent. 200 people had forgotten, I think, that they were breathing. "For how long?" the princess asked. 18 years. Another pause. She looked at him for a long moment with that recalculating expression. And then she did something that none of the behavioral analysts could have predicted based on the 9 days of documentation they'd compiled. She tilted her head, a solving gesture that the integration team had documented as indicating deep respect for an assessment subject, and she said, very clearly, in solving high standard, "I did not see you correctly." The translation array rendered it. The arena absorbed it. Webb inclined his head in that same precise acknowledgement he'd offered at the start. "I appreciate the time, Your Imperial Highness." He stepped off the mat. Section 7, The Aftermath. For a moment, one very long, very strange moment, nobody moved. And then Commander Ashtel sat back down. I don't know why that was the thing that broke the spell. Maybe because it was the solving guard's signal, the closing of the high alert posture, the return to the comfortable attention they'd arrived in. Whatever the reason, when Ashtel sat, something in the room exhaled. The noise that followed was, I'll be honest, I still can't fully characterize it. Not applause, not the relieved chatter of tension breaking. Something quieter than either of those. People turning to the person next to them. People looking at Webb, who had walked back to his position near the staging area and stood exactly as he'd stood before any of this happened. People looking at the princess. Princess Velara had not moved from the center of the mat. She was looking at Webb's retreating back, and the expression on her face was complicated. Real and complicated in the way that expressions are when something has genuinely reached a person behind their professional presentation. Dr. Maida was the first human to move with purpose. She walked, not hurried, but with direction, toward the princess, and said something quiet in solving that she'd learned specifically for situations requiring diplomatic recovery. Something about cultural exchange creating understanding. Something acknowledging the princess's willingness to participate. The princess turned to look at Dr. Maida. She said something in response that the translation array caught in full. "Your people surprise me," the princess said. "I came here knowing your biological data, knowing your capability assessments. I thought I understood what was in this room." A pause. "I was measuring the wrong things." Dr. Maida, to her eternal credit, simply nodded. "We often find that's where the most interesting understanding begins, Your Imperial Highness." The formal program resumed about 10 minutes later, after a short recess that was necessary partly for logistical reasons and partly, I suspect, because most of the integration division staff needed 5 minutes in a corridor to quietly exist in the aftermath of what they'd just watched. The rest of the evening went well, better than well, actually. The solving delegation was more engaged than they'd been at any point in the previous 9 days. Princess Velara asked questions after the remaining demonstrations that were sharper and more substantive than anything before. She spent 40 minutes with Dr. Maida during the post-event reception discussing human military history in a way that had shifted completely from the politely educational framing it had before. Now, She was asking real questions, the kind that come from genuine recalibration. Two of the guards asked the judo instructors for more detailed technical explanations. One of the scientific advisors, who had previously focused entirely on biological and environmental data, asked if there was documentation available on human training methodology across different combat traditions. These were not diplomatic requests. These were people who had seen something they hadn't expected and wanted to understand it better. I watched Webb through most of the reception. He was back in his security position. He wasn't holding court, wasn't fielding questions, wasn't basking in anything. He was doing exactly what he'd been doing before the demonstration, watching the room with that steady, unperforming attention. At some point during the reception, about an hour in, I was standing near enough to the princess and Dr. Maida to hear their conversation. The princess said something that I wrote down in my notes that same evening because I didn't want to forget the exact phrasing. She said, "In our empire we learn to assess threat by measuring capability, size, strength, biological advantage. We have a very precise scale." She paused. "I have never encountered a civilization where the most capable individuals in a room were not the most visible ones." Dr. Maida said, "I think that's one of the more accurate observations anyone's made about us." The princess was quiet for a moment. Then, "How many others like him do you have?" Dr. Maida considered the question carefully. "Enough," she said. The princess looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened in her expression that I can only describe as settling. A reassessment completed, filed, integrated. "Yes," she said, "I believe that.